Oh shoot, I'm muted. Hey, hi. Good night to everyone. Welcome to Alternate Views, the first segment of our Economy Thursdays for 2024. Welcome to as we uh, bring up these new and innovative programs, the Alternate Views, where we could fully discuss the economy of Barbados, the economies of the region, the economies of the world, as we be hosting guests who has the expertise to explain all of the issues to you. And this evening, we welcome Professor Justin Robinson. Professor Robinson, as you know, is the Pro Vice Chancellor at the University of the West Indies, and is also the principal at the UWI Five Islands campus over in Antigua. And he's a regular contributor to the public space. He writes his articles, does interviews, and he gives some excellent contributions as it relates to economic analysis, presenting the facts to you. So we want to welcome Professor Robinson this evening, and I hope that you all enjoy Alternate Views. This Thursday, the 11th of January, we'll be here every Thursday moving forward. So let's welcome Professor Robinson. Professor Robinson, how are you doing tonight?
Okay, hi, good evening to you and your audience, Kemar. All the best for 2024. And congratulations on the show. And thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, well, thank you for your welcome. As you know, we'll be discussing alternate views. The motivation for the show actually started with the book Alternate Views, Barbados Economic Road to Republic. Many of you might not know, but Professor Robinson is one of the persons who Alternate Views is dedicated to. If you read page 3 of Alternate Views, it says right here in the dedication that Professor Robinson is one of the influences, uh, my influences in terms of economists and economy and economic analytics. Because Professor Robinson taught me quite a few courses while I was studying banking and finance at university. So he would have inspired me indirectly to start to pen my economic analytics to paper. So his influence went a long way in terms of shaping my mind. So we're going to jump right in this evening. Don't forget to like and share the page. Share it to your friends. Share it to your colleagues. Because we be discussing the economy at large, but mainly today we want to focus on the debt and the future of debt sustainability in Barbados. How do we develop the country, given the borrowing we've been doing. We know that our borrowing portfolio has changed. As you know, every government does not have the same priority. Different governments have different priorities. So I guess Professor Robinson can give us a opening salvo really. But we'll let him have the floor. This is not really my time to talk. We let the guests do the contributions, and you can always ask your questions in the comments. I'm sure he'll be able to respond, and I'll contribute when necessary. So over to you, sir. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thanks, Kemar. I'll
If
probably thanks again. I'll probably start maybe with my perspective on the Barbados economy end of 2023 and looking forward to 2024. Are you comfortable with that? As I give that as the opening. So I would argue that at the macroeconomic level, 2023, I would say, was another successful year for Barbados. According to the IMF and what the central bank and others are forecasting, we are expected to have growth of around 4.6% this year. And this is the second consecutive year of growth since really we would have had negative GDP growth, which is effectively, negative GDP growth for a year. I would call that a recession. So we had 2019, 2020, and 2021. So it certainly was quite a positive and I think successful to have growth in 2022 and again in 2023. And I do expect this trend to continue with the growth into 2024. And the forecasts are for around growth of between 3 to 4%. So in terms of at the macro level economic growth, I would say 2023 was a successful year. And I expect that to continue in 2024, basically on the grounds of continued strong tourism and the capital investment projects. And I would say the major risk to the growth forecast is how effective the government is in implementing the capital projects, which are expected to drive growth, and the private sector projects coming on stream. Now, I often argue that the population at large, they don't really think of things like GDP. They really experience the economy in the job market and in the supermarket. And 2023 was a positive year in those sense, in that we did see unemployment continue to decline. The latest estimates were 2022, we had an unemployment of about 9.3%, and it's expected to decline to about 8.5% in 2023. So again, we had some job growth. And of course, the rate of inflation, which was a whopping 9.2% in 2022, really one of the highest rates in our modern history. That's expected to moderate to about 5.2% in 2023 when the final numbers are done. Of course, as I say, the consumers, we really want to know the definition of inflation. So a lower rate of inflation doesn't mean that prices are falling, but that they are rising at a slower rate. And certainly, I would expect this trend of inflation moderating to continue unless we have some kind of new external shock. So I think, again, those key macro indicators, growth rate in the economy, unemployment, inflation, they all moved in the right direction in 2023. And I expect that to continue in 2024. In terms of the public finances, again, I certainly give the administration a lot of credit in their management of the public finances. And again, a lot of the key metrics were moving in the right direction. The primary balance is sort of expected to move to a surplus of about 3.5% of GDP, an improvement from 2.5% in 2022. Now, the overall government budget fiscal balance is expected to remain in deficit for 2023, but again, a deficit of about 1.7% compared to 2.1, in 2022. And the debt to GDP is expected to fall to 114.9% of GDP. Again, down from 122.3. So again, those are all moving in the right direction. The foreign exchange reserves also remain at historically high levels. In terms of the decline in the debt to GDP, one of the things I would flag that quite a bit of this decline is due to the inflation. because working out the debt to GDP, we use nominal instead of real GDP. So the government would have said that ratio would have benefited from the higher prices, making GDP higher, as distinct from real actual debt reduction. So, I mean, looking into 2024, one of the things I'm starting to keep an eye on, will the debt to GDP ratio continue to fall as inflation moderates? Because we're not going to get that help from inflation. We're actually going to need to contain the primary deficit. What I see as some of the big challenges, what I see as the main challenge going into 2024 is the fact that domestic investors, which is really the big financial institutions, have not really returned to the market for government debt in sufficient numbers since the debt restructuring. And if we look at, for example, the 2023-2024 deficit, right? The estimates for 2023-24, the gross financing need for Barbados, which is the deficit plus the amortization, the principal on loans, we needed 844 million to cover that. And of this, the government planned to borrow 378 of it from local and 466 international. And this is, I see, as the big challenge, because the financing mix for 2023-24 continued a new trend we saw since 2018, where the majority of government funding is from foreign. Since 2018, we've paid down we've paid off about Barbados. This doesn't include the debt restructuring. We've paid off about 2.9 billion in debt and added another 4.2 billion and borrowed that in debt. And of that 4.2, 3.2 is foreign. It's difficult for me to see us continuing with this heavy foreign debt as something sustainable, even if the funding is at low rates with long maturity, because it means at some point in the future, when the principal on this foreign debt has to be repaid, we're going to be faced where we need to raise foreign debt just to roll over. So I think really that's a big issue. And how does the government get the foreign investors back into the domestic investors, if we are not to continue? And at the microeconomic level, I would say two issues I see as important for 2024. As many people might be aware, we would have made an adjustment to the corporation tax rate. And the international business sector is very important to Barbados in terms of taxes. It provides about 2/3 of our corporation tax. And will the companies remain in Barbados if we are at this new higher tax rate? I think there's a big question mark there. And then the renewable energy drive, which has been a major plank of the country's economic strategy, really, from the last administration, that appears to be stalled on issues of battery storage and base load energy. And, we need a speedy and cost-effective solution. So in conclusion to my opening, I think it'd be fair to say that the indicators suggest that that macroeconomic stability has returned to the economy since the instability really of the 2013 to 18 period, where you had very low reserves, large deficits, primary balances, and so on. And our major trading partners have avoided the recession forecast, so that augurs well for us. I think one of the things we need to watch as an X factor is the health of the Chinese economy. They're now a big economy, and they haven't recovered anywhere near what we expected since COVID. Inflation is expected to moderate. But as I said, Financing the deficits remain a challenge. We really need to change that mix. And as inflation moderates, I think future improvements in the debt to GDP will have to come from fiscal discipline as distinct from the nominal GDP growing. So that's my opening spiel, Kemar.
All right. Well, thank you for that. You said a lot, but remember here we're speaking to an audience that may not follow the economic terminology. Right? So we could start by breaking down like what is the primary balance, right?
Right. So the primary balance is government revenue. You know what the government is earning, and you would subtract from that the government expenditure except the debt service. Okay. So the primary balance, the difference between government revenue, what it's earning, and what we call the non-interest expenditure, what it is spending, not including debt payments. If you want to put that like in a household context schema, your primary balance would be the difference between your monthly salary and your monthly expenses, not including the money you spend repaying your debts, like your mortgage, your car loan, and so on. So when the primary balance is positive, that is when revenue is more than your non-interest expenditure, we have a primary surplus. However, when revenue is less than that, we have a deficit. And why is that important? Because if you're running a primary deficit, what does that really mean? It means that when you have the government revenue, you pay all the other expenses, there still isn't enough money to like pay interest and so on your debts. So you really have to be borrowing money to pay interest and things on debt. And I guess in everyday language, you might think of that as you're almost digging a hole to fill a hole. So it's very important that in managing the public finances, that you're really running primary surpluses.
So, right. So, given the context, we've been doing well in terms of the primary surplus, right? Um, COVID came in, slowed us down a bit in terms of we had to reverse that primary surplus to a deficit momentarily, right? But as we know in Barbados, we earn most of our tax revenues from taxation, really, right? So for a future budget coming up for the financial year 2023 to 2024, where do you see the scope for increased tax revenues? Do you see it coming from further revenue measures? Do you see it coming from expenditure cuts? Do you see a bit of both?
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, that's an interesting question as we are looking forward to the estimates. Now, the single biggest source of tax revenue is the value-added tax. So again, that's what people will call a transaction tax. As people buy goods and services, they pay the VAT. So to some extent, as the economy grows, we would expect VAT revenues to grow along with the growth in the economy without the government raising the rate or doing anything. So I would expect some growth to come and revenues to come from VAT as we continue to grow. One thing we want to watch is what happens with corporation tax this year, because if my memory is correct, I mean, most of the tax rate, the maximum tax rate in Barbados was about, I think, 5%. And it was on a scale of somewhere between 1.5, I think, to 5.5. With the global minimum tax, I think our tax is now going up to like 9% or something like that. So if the companies stay, and I don't think many of them have a choice this, at least for this year, we could see a windfall in corporation tax for this year, but there will be a risk going forward next year. So I don't really anticipate any new revenue generating measures in the budget or the estimates. I mean, I don't know if people's memories are fading now, but one of the main reasons we have a primary surplus now, because really between 2018 and 2021, our economy really didn't grow. It was in negative territory. If the economy is in negative territory and your primary balance is improving, a lot of that is coming from new revenue raising measures, which is why I think sometimes people say, well, Justin, you say this thing is going so good on the public finances, but I'm not feeling it and I'm hurting. And in part, the improvement in the public finances, where you don't have growth, is really coming from the fact the government is extracting more from the economy. So we've had a lot of revenue raising measures since 2018. There's been a lot of sacrifice. You only really have to go back to the 2018 and 2019 budgets, and there were a significant number of revenue generating measures. So I would be quite surprised to see new revenue raising measures. And I don't really expect significant cuts in expenditure. I think we might see some stuff with some of the state-owned enterprises. We might see some reduction in transfers and subsidies, because I know we have the restructuring of the BAMC and other aspects, because this is now one of the things we might expect to see in this phase of the BERT program, or BERT 2. So there might be some reductions in transfers and subsidies. So that's what I might be anticipating. If there's a windfall in corporation tax, I don't know if we will have any eases. I'm not optimistic about that. But I don't expect any new revenue raising measures. I mean, we had a lot of that between 2018 and 19.
Yeah, very interesting. You spoke about revenue generation measures, so I just wanted to give the audience what some of those measures look like under the Barbados Economic and Recovery Transformation Plan. For those persons who may have their copies of alternative views, I'm taking it from page 55 in the book, where we spoke about the revenue generation measures that the government put in place in the budget, right? So, number one was the repeal of the NSRL from July 1st, 2018. Uh, that was one of them. We then had the fuel tax, which was this fuel tax was being levied at 40 cents per liter and 40 cents per liter of diesel and 5% of kerosene. There was also a new fee for the registration upon the purchase of new or second-hand private vehicles. Also, there was a requirement to pay a registration fee of $1,000 for commercial vehicles. So that is the vehicles that you see with the C license plate. There was also changes to the income tax bands, where the government introduced a new tax band of about 40%, and that will be classified as upper income tax. Uh, the persons who are paid below $25,000 a year, you remain tax free, and all income above $25,000 to $60,000 continue to attract an income tax rate of 16%. And those persons whose income was $60,000 to $75,000, you attracted 33.5%. And those persons who were over that attracted a tax band of 40%. And those new tax measures terms of income tax, were supposed to raise significant revenues. The government also, as Professor Robinson said, spoke about the corporation tax as well. Um, if you remember, the government started to lose corporate tax revenues as far back as 2000 and uh, 16, 17, when the Canadian government extended the exempt surplus arrangement with Canada. And that exempt surplus arrangement is where Canadian companies who were domiciled in Barbados could have repatriated their incomes for tax free. Right? So the Canadian government then extend that benefit to many other Caribbean countries who had lower corporate tax rates as far down as zero. So countries like Saint Lucia and the other countries receive a lot of our a lot of our Canadian companies that we had here, and we had a whole of about $300 million in corporate tax revenues and losses every year. And but we won't go so deep into that. But the government in 2018 then raised the corporate tax rates in Barbados from 25% to 30%, and then they lowered it to 5%. So we suspect there may be some fallout when it goes back up to I think it was about 12, Professor Robinson. Uh,
Yeah, but I think the rate here, the local rate is 9, and then there'll be some top up. It's a little complicated.
yeah, yeah, right. But we'll wait until more information comes out. There was also the value-added tax on online purchases as well. Then there was the health service contribution, which was about 2.5%, which was maintained to go to the health system. And those measures, along with the departure tax at the airport, the room rate levies on Airbnb and other room accommodations, uh, right, and that was mainly it in terms of the revenue measures. So these revenue measures accounted to about $300 million in tax collection revenues only. So that is why we can safely say that the government has collected the highest levels of tax revenues ever in the history of Barbados' tax collection, right? Because of the agreement with the IMF to meet the primary surplus target, and that primary surplus target is intended to correct, or was intended to correct, some macroeconomic imbalances in terms of where the government had shortfalls in revenue because we didn't have access to local debt like before. This is a local debt from the central bank. Uh, we could not print in any money really. We couldn't use the NAS to prop up the budgets either. So the government had to find other ways to collect revenues, and that is why they put in the mini budget and put these revenue measures in place. So after the revenue measures, also, Professor Robinson asked him about cuts, and he spoke about the state-owned enterprises. So part of the IMF program, this new IMF program that we had, the heavy focus was on state-owned enterprise reform and pension reform. Hey, we part of the SOE reform would definitely mean the reduction, as Professor Robinson said, the reduction in transfers to SOEs. Now, the transfers to SOEs, in more simple terms, simply means that central government gives these state-owned enterprises like a salvation, or they get a piece of the money to run their daily operations. But a lot of the SOEs are not for profit, and they don't make profit, and they operate in the red, and the government subsidizes the operation. But part of the IMF conditionalities now we don't have that luxury to the extent that we had it before, and the government has to put some corrective measures to allow especially the ones who have commercial underpinnings, allow them to function on their own, independent of government salvation, right? So that is why you get the reforms to the NAS, the reforms to sanitation, reforms to the Barbados Water Authority, reforms to the education system, reforms to the hospital. But Professor Robinson, the reforms to the SOEs is good in terms of correcting the economic problem, but on the ground where the people are at, the people who will use these government services, there seems to be a disconnect. So could you help us, help the layman to understand some of the reasons for the reforms, maybe, and help them to have a deeper understanding of the disconnect between what the maybe what the government and the IMF may be proposing in terms of reforms, and how they could continue to live without you know um, putting themselves under significant pressure.
Well, that's always the sort of really big challenge in managing the public finances. I mean, you're trying to keep the gap between your revenues and your spend relatively small. Because when government spends more than it collects, the only way to fill that gap is borrowing. And we don't particularly want to build up too much of that debt. So you really either need to raise your revenues, lower, which is more taxation and fees, or you cut your spend. Now, ideally, you want the growth in your revenue to come from a growing economy. If the economy is growing, then you certainly get higher income tax, value-added tax naturally. Maybe one of the classic elements of the question you're raising would be 2018, where you had that levy or that fee come in terms of what you pay on your water bills. So that was introduced. Now that money you paid to BWA, and it goes to help the BWA as well as the SSA. So it means the government has to give them a smaller transfer, which improves the government finances. I think it also improves the cash flow of SSA and BWA. However, clearly for the consumers who have to pay this new amount that they previously didn't have to pay, that's clearly quite painful. And people like pensioners and others, that's a big chunk. So it's really quite painful. So in a sense, when you're trying to fix a deficit, I don't know that there's any painless way. I think one of the issues that then becomes a lot more pertinent is, the quality of the service people are getting, particularly now that they are paying for it sort of more directly. I mean, we've seen the BAMC get restructured. That's certainly not wonderful for persons directly employed in that sector. So we are watching to see how that plays out. So again, we have these really difficult choices that have to be made. And ideally, you want to do this through a growing economy, as distinct from having to, impose austerity in the form of expenditure cuts, which reduces what the government offers to people in terms of goods and services, and or charging higher taxes, fees, and levies. So again, I'd be very surprised to see any significant new revenue raising measures in Barbados in the upcoming estimates or the budget.
Yeah. Well, speaking about revenue measures, right? I, I guess most Barbadians would look forward to the notion of economic growth through projects, right? The most policymakers would think, well, if we build some nice buildings, maybe around, we build some nice hotels like the Sam Lars, the Hyatt, these type of projects, this hotel-based. We traditionally focus on hotel-based investment in Barbados, right? Uh, so could you inform us about how projects and the use of projects? Uh, we've heard significant plans for the country in terms of development, right? So could you help us to understand how projects could help to drive the economy? Could those projects help to slow down the rate of borrowing? Um, help us to understand how these projects really help to drive economic growth, how it helps to give jobs, what it does for the local space. Yeah.
Yeah, so again, maybe if you sort of think back to a sort of fairly simple equation about the economy, I think that people learn this at like O levels and A levels, where the GDP is made up, has some components: consumption, the C, what people spend. Consumption is what we spend every day, plus investment. So increase consumption, increase investment. Then you have the effect of government. And then you have exports minus imports. So you think of those as the components. The projects really relate a lot to the investment part. Now, if you look at the Barbados economy, because of how the economy is, we are a small island state without certain resources and so on. So in effect, we end up importing a lot of stuff. So if you have growth in consumption, so think about it, Kemar. If persons on the show got an extra $1,000, what would they spend it on? Now, if they go out and spend that 1,000, that's an increase in consumption, which is normally good for GDP. The economy would grow because of the increase in that C. But what would you spend that $1,000 on? You go and buy a set of new headphones. Somebody buys a new phone. A lot of it is, even you buy some increased food, some new shoes, clothes, a lot of it is imported. And imports are a reduction in GDP. So one of the things we know about the Barbados economy is that growth is heavily driven by the investment component. And the projects are a lot about the investment. So you fix the roads, you have a new road, there's a new hotel, there's a new hospital, any of these types of things. People get jobs doing the construction. As they get paid, they go and spend the money and so on. So that investment is what drives it. And hopefully that investment also has a benefit even after the construction and the build out is finished, because the hotel means you can accommodate more guests and so on. So a lot of our growth is driven really by that investment and having those projects, and getting the growth in the economy is going to be very dependent on executing that project. Now, I think there are a couple of issues that we have to think about in Barbados. One, who is doing the investment? Government versus the private sector. If you have the government doing most of that investment to drive growth, then the government is going to be financing that investment by borrowing. So you can have the growth, but then the government has to service the debt down the road. So we much rather have a lot of that investment come from the private sector. Otherwise, growth that is driven by a lot of government investment, financed by government borrowing, runs the risk of creating a debt problem down the road. That's something we really have to look at, that mix of private. Now, one of the other issues, like we don't talk about it a lot in Barbados, is really maybe inequality or the distribution. So you can have growth, but how is that growth shared? So if these projects and the way they are done and the way they're executed and structured, that most of the benefits are going to a small group, then you can have growth in an overall sense, but most people are not feeling it. So really what people call inclusive growth, more inclusive growth. And you mentioned the hotels and others. And I think one of the things, one of the biggest challenges in Barbados is how do you create more high paying jobs or better paying jobs? And having investments, having sectors that are generating more high paying jobs so that people are really earning an income that allows them to have a certain quality of life in the Barbados of today, given the cost of living, the cost of getting things done. And I think that's really one of our very big challenges. You can have growth, but the growth is generating jobs that create what some people call like the working poor. You're working, but you're not earning enough for a decent standard of living. You are better off than if you are not working. But these are not necessarily really life-changing jobs in terms of the quality. But how do we generate a better quality of jobs? More better paying jobs to people.
Well, there you said it. My problem with the traditional projects that we for hotels, right? In Barbados, we traditionally built hotels on what you call fiscal incentives, right? Which allow the hotels to import or to have duty-free imports on like building materials, you know, even when they do set up, you still have uh, subsidies as it relates to some foods. So you allow you get them tax breaks as well, right? Which these things encourage investment up front, right? But in the back end, you then substitute those or the collection of that revenue. Then governments right have to find a way to be able to recoup those upfront subsidies, right? So I understand that the fiscal incentives bill has been repealed, which means that we no longer have that route to encourage hotel investment or tourism investment into the country, right? So I was wondering how plausible it is for hotels, one, to hire more local people in the workspace, right? So that the benefits can trickle down much further into the economy. For the hotels to use more local artisans, so like local furniture. Uh, we don't really manufacture that many building things, but cement, we manufacture cement in Barbados. But more the building materials, uh, to encourage more local entrepreneurs to be involved in the big projects, right? That you could get a better spread around, and they could create more employment for my friends and people who are unemployed. That would reduce the unemployment numbers in the country and help to contribute to economic growth. But I find that when we bring the hotels here, the only thing we really benefit is jobs, which is lower and middle tier jobs, some high level jobs, not many. And you charge them with the government no putting like the room rate levies and the different levies or whatever to do the collection. But there's no real sustained benefit. I mean, you could correct me on that point. There's no real sustained, prolonged benefit to inviting the hotel style investment based off the tradition that we have. Now, I don't know that we've made changes in terms of how we encourage uh, hotel investment. But I'd like to understand a way forward for those type of investments and how it can more benefit the locals and being involved and getting a piece of the action.
Okay, so I mean, I think it's a complicated issue. So at one level, if we look at, so tourism remains a sort of major sector for Barbados, and one would expect that to continue. And one thing I want to encourage people to think about as well, when we think of tourists coming to Barbados, they're what we can call the supply side factors. Okay, the supply side factors. We tend to naturally, as humans, focus a lot on the demand side. What do people do when they come here, the attractions, and so on. But supply side things would be like the size of our room stock, how many hotels we have, how many rooms we have, the availability of a direct flight to Barbados, and so on. These are very important decisions for persons in coming to Barbados. So enhancing the hotel room stock does improve our capacity to absorb tourists. So there's a long-term benefit from that, besides the construction phase and the outfitting phase and so on. So I think that's important to keep in mind. I think as a mature destination, though, one of the issues we face, and I think we hear it a lot in the public space, as the policymakers look for new areas to have hotels and other spaces, persons in Barbados are now expressing concerns about environmental factors, might be encroaching on spaces that have been public spaces that Barbadians were traditionally using quite a bit. A lot of our hotel product has been on the south and the west coast and limited in other areas, as we have them like in Bridgetown and other areas. And some other and new areas, I think people are getting I think we are getting some of that classic debate really about overdevelopment, what is the net benefit, and so on. And I think these are very important issues for us to, as a population, to ventilate and decide on the way forward. In general, if we don't have alternatives, I think it's better to have it than not to have it. But I think everybody welcomes investment that offers more inclusive opportunities, more inclusive growth, higher paying jobs, less environmentally impactful. In some ways, the hotel sector, almost by definition, offers mid to lower skill, lower income jobs, especially in the context of modern Barbados. So the way I think about it, it's really what are some of the new sectors that are going to emerge, that are going to grow and offer some of these new opportunities to diversify, so that tourism becomes less important, not really in an absolute sense, but in a relative sense, because other sectors are important. Because if you go to New York and London, tourism is a big sector in those places. But they also have other big sectors. I mean, so one of our challenges, again, because of our geography and so on, outside tourism, we don't have other big sectors. The international business sector is our next big foreign exchange earning sector. So I think really one of our challenges, what are these new growth catalysts? I can't claim to have any fantastic ideas or knowledge as to what they might be, but again, there are a lot of creative persons out there, people with ideas, and it's to have a policy framework and a mindset to facilitate those persons with those new ideas, or at the very least, not stifle them. So I don't know if I've answered the question you sort of posed.
Yeah, well, you even explain it better that I actually wanted. Yeah, I think the way in which the world is changing, all countries are requiring more from policymakers about inclusive domestic growth, including domestic growth into these projects. We have, and you touched on it a bit. Barbados has a foreign exchange constraint where our limited size and geography, we have limited funds available. So that is why we have to borrow foreign exchange from the IMF, the AADB, and these places because we don't have the capacity to earn at those levels. And the diversification of the economy right now is essentially important, uh, given the fact how COVID stopped the ships from coming, stopped the planes from flying, and there was significant drawback in our tourism numbers, and we're still feeling that right now. So, if there are any more external shocks like another COVID, then Barbados is left reeling all over again. And
Kima, so again, in terms of where you're going there, so that's why, like in my opening bit, I would have mentioned the renewable energy sector. So, for example, I see that as having a lot of potential in the sense that in the long term, it's a foreign exchange saving sector. In that, if we can generate a large, significant percentage of our energy from solar, wind, and so on, instead of importing some of the fossil fuels. So that's, as you people say, a dollar saved is a dollar earned. So that's a very important initiative and trust, I think. And because I see a question, why aren't we having more investment from the private sector? I see that on the screen. And certainly the private sector would have embraced opportunities to invest in the renewable energy sector. I know that's been one of the attractive areas. Now, that is sort of stalled on some issues of storage and what is the base load. So the question, why aren't we having more investment from the private sector? I think private sector makes investments where they see a return on their investment relative to risk. So it's really, I think private sector investment is driven by the availability of attractive investments, the whole ease of doing business, so the capacity to make those investments, and then the access to financing to actually fund those investments. And I think in some ways we might have challenges in all three areas. I don't know what are the really attractive risk return investments available in Barbados. I mean, I think if you could ask the question to yourself, if you had $10 million to invest, what would you put it in? I think, again, the ease with which investments are facilitated, going through approvals and so on, and then the access to financing. So I think it's a combination of those three factors that may be influencing the level of investment. Although, again, so the private sector to date is still very interested in these hospitality and tourism related projects, which makes sense. Barbados has a comparative advantage in that sector. We are an iconic tourist destination. It's a sector we know and have some competencies in. And the private sector certainly has embraced the opportunities to invest in renewable energy. Although, again, we are facing some serious bottlenecks with that. And I certainly look forward to hearing in the budget or at some point, what are the government strategies to really deal with the blockages and really release that flow of investment.
well, we have another question for you here, Professor. We have someone asking, saying, "Good evening, gentlemen. Good evening, everyone. I'm late, but I'd like to ask Professor Robinson whether Professor Robinson sees room for industries based off innovation in Barbados and the region. And I guess that is what you were explaining in terms of the renewable energy as a saver of foreign exchange, um, in innovative idea. I know that the government made some changes as it relates to the Barbados Light and Power. The old structure of the monopoly that the Light and Power had on energy has been changed. And we're seeing other players coming into the renewable energy market, building out solar farms and, having the PV panels. Um, we're seeing that we even have with the banks and the credit unions doing having investment portfolios or renewable energy plants and stuff. Uh, and as Professor Robinson said, he looks forward in the budget to what the government does know at a policy level to make it easier to develop the renewable energy sector, not as an earner of foreign exchange, but to save foreign exchange, because we know that we have a very big budget every year that goes into purchasing oil and gas. So
Right.
every couple of months there's a shock when there's a war, like the war in Ukraine and Russia, when the Red Sea gets blocked, when the ships right, when the ships can't come and these type of things happen, then the price of oil goes up, and then the government has to look for the resources to get
So
extra
yeah,
foreign
so
exchange.
I think it
Yeah.
was the Nation, one of the papers, I think this week had a very good set of comments on what we are dealing with renewable energy. So I'm not the most technical in this area, but I think the Light and Power all had always made it clear that once you get to about 100 MWh of renewable energy on the grid, that we could face a challenge because of what they call instability in Okima. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow at the adequate level. So once you get up to that level, they need to be able to store that energy, or you have renewable energy that can serve as a ongoing what they call base load. I think we are we are at about 89 megawatt hours, so they are almost at that 100 benchmark. So they really can't add any significant amounts of renewable onto the grid until we have some renewable energy source that can serve as base energy, or there's some way to store the wind and solar energy. Now, I guess the way people do that now is with batteries. There are a lot of different technologies, but that's going to require another big investment. So I can have a big concern there, because that was one of the areas of where the private sector was investing. People have put out money, but that's very much stalled. And I think that does need to be unblocked. And what are the solutions in that area? Because that had a lot of potential in terms of private sector investment, also creating some different kind of jobs too. Because these solar panels, wind farm, they have to be installed. So people are getting jobs doing the installation. You have maintenance, electricians, and those types of people were certainly getting. So it really was opening up. We saw some new small businesses come up in that area as well. The commercial banks were doing some lending using some of that liquidity and so on. So it really was one of those new emerging things where we had some industry, almost manufacturing. I mean, generating energy is a form of manufacturing, which has been dead for a long time. So kind of like the question the person asks about innovation, you sort of have to think of different ways of really having industry and innovation. So I think that's something I am looking for, to see what sort of solutions are on the table to deal with that.
So do you have any? Can you give any ideas about an incentive that the government could use to motivate those type of changes?
Well, I think the way we have our economy structured now and our policy, I think it's important for policy to be consistent. I don't know that we really have a lot of room for the government to be offering these fiscal incentives. Clearly, we are on a path to try to get our debt to GDP to 60% by 2035, I think. So those fiscal incentives. Also, the corporation tax rate is already significantly lower. So I think we've moved away from that fiscal incentives framework. And in some ways, that low corporation tax rate is the ultimate fiscal incentive. I think it's more about the ease of doing business, facilitating those investments in terms of getting the approvals, laying the infrastructure, and so on. I think these are the really important elements. And I'm interested to hear what are the government solutions or what are the initiatives in terms of forms of storage, forms of base load, renewable energy, and so on. Where I don't think it's really so much about fiscal incentives, but it's creating the structures within which those investments can be made. If Light and Power is going to make the investment in battery storage, how are they going to recover that investment? And so on. And we might need to have a broad discussion about energy policy. Yeah. Maybe
Yeah.
we might need to level with people that a significant amount of renewable energy, it will save us foreign exchange. It would give us energy security, but it might not be cheaper. Your light bill might not go down. It might be stable. Or maybe, we are a small island developing state. We can't generate enough carbons and to affect the climate change. And maybe we need to think of what is a sensible mix of fossil fuel and renewable energy for a place like Barbados. I think these are important conversations, that we might need to rethink the whole. In a sense, if we go for, say, 100% renewable energy, can we do that? And that would be very useful in terms of energy security, in that we are not relying on imports coming in. It's very good for the environment, and we save the foreign exchange, but it might not be cheaper on the consumer when you factor in storage and all of that. And these are conversations we need to have. And maybe in a sense, in the simple term, your light bill might not come down, which I think we are all thinking intuitively. And if we gain it from the sun and the wind and not the oil, it might be cheaper. But there's a cost to the infrastructure to get that into your house when you turn on your switch, and it might not come down. Or what do we really want 100% renewable? Is that ideal for a place like Barbados where we can't really generate enough CO2 to affect the climate? What is a sensible mix of fossil fuels and renewables for Barbados? I think these are very important conversations we need to have with a solutions mindset.
Yeah. Well, we can start. Let's ask the people: would you be willing to pay a higher electricity rate if it encourages the government to make a change over to renewable energy structure, if it allows them to save foreign exchange, are these conversations that we are willing to have? Um, I mean, what you're giving here is an honest assessment, but if I'm being fair, I actually listened to the Minister of Energy at the time. That was Mr. Kerry Simmons, and he was saying to the public on the floor of Parliament that um, when government switches over to the renewable energy, that could have cut prices as low as 40%. Right. So you're already technical guy, the expertise, but then on the other hand, there's the political aspect in that. the politicians are the one who would have to implement the ideas to move forward. So I guess we both know that there's a general disconnect between what the politicians may want, what the politicians may tell the public, uh, and then for the technical persons like yourself coming to bring the information, then there will be the breakdown in communication because the general public will hear, well, the politicians promised me a lower like bill if I sign over to the grid, and I'd be able to sell my electricity back to the grid and become an earner, right? And become an earner. But no, the technical people with the expertise are saying that that might not be so. Uh, if you do go over, you might have to pay a slightly higher cost. Uh, so what can we do there in terms of bridging that information gap?
So again, I think it's about having, and I mean, like forums like what you are having here and others, where we sort of ventilate these issues. What energy, what are the implications of 100% renewable by a certain date? And given where we are, how does that translate into the consumer and the cost of energy in the country relative to, say, the foreign exchange savings and having that energy security? And what is the appropriate mix? And I think we need, I mean, I'm not an expert in the energy area, but I certainly know enough to know that a country like Barbados, we cannot generate enough CO2 gases to affect to really affect the climate that is really driven by the large industrialized countries. So should we be shooting for 100% renewable energy? Is that a sensible energy mix for a small island state like Barbados? I think these are very important discussions that, again, forums like yours are part of it to sort of push that conversation up the national agenda.
Well, I believe for a country that has the natural infrastructure to give us renewable energy, but this is my belief. All government buildings should be solar powered by 2030. Right? If not all, majority, most of them. Right? I find that the use of electricity in government wastage. We have a lot of wastage in government. So if I had to make a recommendation to policymakers, I would say the first area to start would be government buildings and getting all of the government buildings on solar panels, and let's start there.
But Kima, what I'm saying to you, one of the things you might have to accept, though, is that government's energy bill, unless they're going to go off grid, where maybe they invest in the panels plus the batteries and what's the cost of that, it doesn't necessarily mean that the light bill is going to go down. That's what I'm trying to suggest. Because having that infrastructure of the panels plus the battery storage and all of that required to have a reliable grid, there's a cost to that. Because if depending on what it costs to invest in the battery storage or some other technology so that we can add more renewable to the grid and have a stable grid, somebody has to pay for that. Huh? And when we factor in all of that, then we sort of have to look at how these numbers play out. Huh?
Yeah. Well, I spoke to a entrepreneur in the renewable energy sector, a fairly large entrepreneur in the space, and he was suggesting a carbon tax to fund the investment of the renewable energy drive.
Yeah, so that's one
Um,
option. That's one way of funding it.
mhm.
It won't be on your light bill, but you pay for it somewhere else. Yeah,
Yeah,
no. So
yeah.
that's one of the ideas, and if you can figure out a way, there's a way that the carbon tax could depend on your carbon footprint. But certainly, in terms of economic policy, I think economists are not a tribe that agree on many things, but many economists do agree that the ideal policy in terms of climate change is to have a carbon tax set at an appropriate level to really move the world away from this fossil fuel driven economy now. And that's not a new finding. That view has been around 20, 30 years. Obviously, the politics of doing that, because the level at which that might be set and so on. So the politics, but so the carbon tax is around. It'd be interesting to see the logistics of that. It's certainly theoretically and I think very few economists would disagree on this. Conceptually, it is the ideal way to deal with the whole issue of climate change.
Well, Canada had a carbon tax, or still has a carbon tax. Um, but let me ask you this: we are sort of become the climate champions of the world, Barbados, right? We have the Bridgestone Initiative. We have, I think, a whole ministry being set up to tackle climate issues. We're looking at climate financing, given our vulnerability as a region to hurricanes and land slippage and all of these things. But then on the other hand, we're still looking to invest in fossil fuels, right? Uh, Barbados issued licenses to drill oil off the island. Um, Not so recent, but recent still. Um, we still have investments in Guyana. We're still seeking uh, still drilling for gases off Trinidad and Lake. So how would you fit our inclination to still, because I think part of that was asking the larger countries in the world to pay us, give us a stipend or something, or as an incentive to keep our oil and gas in the ground, because we don't have the wherewithal to not pump fossil fuel because we're still heavily dependent, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah. I mean, I mean, these are very complicated issues, huh? And so let's take our neighbor there, Venezuela. I'm sorry, Guyana. Guyana, I mean, many of us growing up, Guyana has really been not a well-off country. Can you really, I mean, do we really want to deny Guyana the chance to exploit its fossil fuels and significantly transform the lives of people in Guyana? I mean, that's a very difficult call. But on the climate change thing, though, Kemar, I kind of want to elaborate a bit because I think there are two aspects to it that I think it'd be useful for your audience to appreciate. There's what you call climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. So there are already two elements in this fight around climate change: climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. So when we get electricity from like solar panels, you drive an electric car and so on, you are engaging in what we call climate change mitigation. You are using your vehicle using a fuel source that does not damage the climate. You're getting your electricity from a source that doesn't damage the climate. So that's climate change mitigation. And then there's adaptation, because climate change is already here. How do you adjust or adapt to the fact that that climate is already affecting how you live? So if, say, for example, we were to improve our defenses against floods, that's an example of climate change adaptation. And I think one of the important things about the Bridgetown Initiative, and I think the government and its advocacy in this area has been outstanding, is how do we get the funding to adjust, to adapt to climate change, to do climate change adaptation. So one of the flagships, and it's something that Caribbean countries and other islands have been asking for over 20 years, this whole idea of a loss and damage fund, so that if we get hit, if because of a climate change, we get a bad weather event, we get a really bad flooding in Barbados, how do you pay for that damage? You get a hurricane. We've seen Dominica get hit by a hurricane, the country almost wiped out. So you have a fund that can help us finance the losses and damage that comes from the adverse weather effects linked to climate change. I think these are very important elements. I totally have a view that in Barbados, the climate adaptation is much more important for us to be focused on, because we are at the front line of the climate crisis. We are small island states, a place like Barbados, very low level. So adaptation is very important for us. Mitigation, I think, is second for us, because we can't generate enough bad stuff to affect the climate. It's really what China, India, Brazil, the United States, Europe, and those big countries, they are the ones that have to engage in mitigation, adaptation. So I think we have to be very smart as a country. If we are a developing country, we have a lot of deficits we need to correct. So if we can exploit if we have fossil fuel resources that we can exploit, I don't see any reasons why we can't be climate champions, but still earn a berry from what resources we have. And I gave the example of Guyana. Should Guyana really be denied the chance to exploit those resources? And if they don't, then I think they should be compensated. I mean, it would be easy to sit and say that, but if you look at what Guyana has gone through for almost all of my life, I mean, I've sort of grown up with Guyana as a very weak, struggling economy. Now they have a chance to really transform people's lives in a positive way. I don't see how we can sit here from the comfort of Barbados, Kemar, and say they can't do that. The relative comfort of Barbados.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. I think Guyana is very well poised to lead the development of the region, given their recent oil finds. Um, Much earlier, the point that I raised is really to get political interference in natural resources. Um, I guess in Africa and other oil-rich countries, if you don't have the proper leadership to manage those resources, then countries tend not to monetize in the way they should on such resources. Um, I think I said openly on the show, I interviewed a professor of economics from Canada. His name was Dr. Terence Yip, and he wrote a book called "Is Guyana Ready for the Oil Bonanza?" And he said in that book that his criticism of the uh, handling of the oil were that the Guyanese people only received 2% of the royalties of all of the oil sold, right? And now you have the political voices saying that they want to renegotiate the contracts with ExxonMobil, probably up to 10% or 12% or so. Um, but that is where the problem comes, where countries
Yeah,
who
I mean,
don't.
and we know this very well. Oil in itself doesn't guarantee that a path to wealth. Nigeria hasn't become wealthy because of its significant despite that, Venezuela struggles. I mean, they really have a lot of oil. So again, it depends, as you've alluded to, what are the contracts you negotiate with the persons, and how does the government manage the resources? What do they do with it. So the challenges of managing natural resource wealth is one of the oldest issues in economics, and it has to be managed quite well. So it doesn't guarantee, but it gives them a chance. That it gives them a chance they haven't had for 30, 40, 50 years. And I certainly wouldn't be one to deny them that chance unless they're getting some kind of significant compensation for so doing.
Well, I think I agree with you. I wouldn't try to rob them of that opportunity. I think they should grasp the opportunity. Um, I think Barbados can help significantly in the development of Guyana. Um, our education system is top tier. Uh, that we could be able to advise, set up services. So
And
I
also,
definitely.
we could even benefit from, our much maligned tourism industry. As the Guyanese get richer, they're going to come down here. They're going to be able to come down here and spend a whole set of money for crop over. Guyana doesn't really have beaches. Some of that money, we already see that with Trinidadians. I think something is a little invisible, but for Barbados, Barbados is a nice little playground to come and really enjoy themselves. At UWI, we get a lot of students who they could do it at St. Augustine, but they come here because they kind of enjoy the environment. So even just from what we have already, as the Guyanese get richer, some of that, rich Guyanese gonna want to buy a villa on the West Coast and that kind of stuff. They have a lot of affinity to Barbados and a lot of that. So, and again, there are opportunities for high-paying jobs around that sector for Barbadians with our level of education and so on, as you say, because you need professionals as they build out other stuff. I think there's a real opportunity for us to benefit from an economic boom in a country that we are familiar with and which we have bonds. We didn't always treat them the best, but I don't think the Guyanese has held those events against us.
Well, um, no, we're on Guyana, right? I want to touch on Guyana and Jamaica specifically, in that those were two countries who had long IMF rule, right? Um, and coming out of that, those changes would have been softened currencies, or with a layman understanding, devalued currencies, right? They're not like Barbados that has the 2-to-1 currency peg. So in the future Guyana, do you see it being economically feasible for Guyana to peg its currency like? Guyana had a peg before to the Great Britain pound. The currency of Guyana was not always weak. The Jamaican economy had uh, its peg to the British pound as well. So do you see that for Guyana's future, much like Barbados?
Yeah, I'm not aware of a lot of discussion around that. I don't see them moving to a fixed exchange rate. I don't really see them moving to a peg, but as the economy improves and they earn more foreign exchange and so on, because right now they have a floating exchange rate, they don't have a peg. So what may very well happen is that I really don't see them going to a peg. I don't see the particular advantages for them of doing that. What could happen though is that as the economy improves, as they earn a lot of foreign exchange, that their currency could get stronger. So the Guyanese exchange rate could improve naturally. We have seen some of that in Jamaica where their exchange rate has improved. It's strengthened vis-a-vis the US dollar. Nowadays it's more stable than strengthening. So I don't expect Guyana to move to any fixed exchange rate. I don't see the benefits of that for them, particularly if they're earning all these oil revenues in US dollars. I don't see why they would go to a peg, but their exchange rate could improve.
Why I asked that was because I want to measure my words here carefully, right? Part of Barbados's reason for a lack of investment, right, is the peg, right? And I've read documentation from the IMF and other places suggesting that the Barbadian currency may need to be softened a bit to allow, because I mean we at the point we have high debt to GDP, interest payments are climbing, so we don't have much policy space or room. So to get that investment, you allow the currency to be cheaper, that large investors could buy up the debt and give you some room to do what you have to do, right?
Like I kind of see that as a bit of, I see that perspective as not well suited for Barbados. Unless we really find a lot of oil, I wouldn't even entertain that. The fixed exchange rate peg serves as a very useful policy anchor for Barbados. If we want to maintain the 2-to-1 peg, there are things we have to do, and I think that shapes our policy. Our major export is already priced in US dollars, Kemar. We don't quote hotel rooms or anything like that in Barbados dollars to foreigners. It's already priced in US. So a sort of softening the currency doesn't really help in that particular sense. And if we were to soften the currency, what are the domestic inputs that we would be switching to? I think, in fact, we would just be making the product more expensive, because we would then, the imported inputs that we need would just cost us more. So I think, given the structure of our economy, our natural endowments, what we have, I think the fixed exchange rate suits Barbados very well. What we need is the fiscal discipline to maintain that fixed exchange rate. I think what we've done in terms of doing some liberalization in the foreign exchange market to allow people to have their foreign currency accounts, make it easier to move money in and out. I think those are things we should be looking at and how we manage that. But maybe I'm too stuck in the orthodoxy around the Barbados economy. I don't know, but I don't see any real benefits to us at this time of softening the currency.
Yeah. Well, but
The
see that
currency.
there's a difference, or there's proposed differences in the practice of economics. I find that the IMF recommendations sometimes are more suited to more larger developed economies as opposed to the more smaller ones. And it will definitely take a time for them to understand the intricacies of an economy like Barbados, and the peg. Because I did read the recommendation, but I agreed with it. I did
Right,
read
right.
it, and I
Yeah, and the
understand.
point you're making is a very important one. I think one of the things, certainly the UWI tradition that I was exposed to in terms of learning stuff, but, there's a way in which a child, right, Kima? A child is not a small adult. A child is a very different creature from an adult. So a child is not just a small adult. So again, Barbados, a small island state, is not just a small version of a big economy. There are some fundamental differences between a child and an adult. And there are some fundamental differences between a small island state like Barbados and a large Caribbean state like Jamaica or Guyana, or a large industrialized country like the US and Germany, or whatever, and the policy prescriptions and how you deal with them, I think, have to be different. And one of the dangers in economics and finance and that is that there's a lot of discussion where you're almost seeing the same. When you take any medicine, Kemar, any medicine does have an adult dose and a child dose, But when we look at economic policy, a lot of the discussions now, we almost don't hear any distinction between small and big countries. It's almost the same thing for everybody. I think that's very dangerous. I think we have to continue to push back against that, even though it's not popular.
Well, I want to take a piece from you here. Now that we're on the issue of pegs and foreign exchange, a piece that you wrote to the Nation newspaper speaking about the current account deficit of Barbados reaching $1 billion. For the viewers' sake, the current account deficit deals with the foreign exchange element of the country, basically where you earn versus where you spend. Traditionally, Barbados always, not always, but you would say always had a deficit, but a small deficit, like hundreds of millions, two hundreds of millions, and we will usually borrow that, right? Because we have or had the capacity to, to be able to repay. Uh, but now, due to the collapse in tourism, that deficit has now grown to $1 billion, and to cover those losses of foreign exchange due to the tourism and the impact of COVID, um, we've now ramped up the foreign borrowing to be able to cover that deficit. And unless we could get tourism to perform at a high level, that deficit will stay high for some time. So I wanted to ask you, Professor Robertson, based off your news media article, to give us some insights on Barbados's current account deficit being $1 billion for almost 3 consecutive years.
Okay, right. And can you remind me what those years were, if you don't mind? Well, what are those years?
2020 to 2021, 2021 to 2022, and now 2023.
Yeah, because certainly it was almost inevitable that you would have that massive plunge with COVID. Okay, because our main source of foreign exchange earnings on the current account is tourism. And really, from about March 2020, the sector shut down. I mean, we all saw those videos with the monkeys taking over hotels and all of that. So with really with the tourism sector being shut down, it was almost a given that that would happen. And there's no quick way to correct that. But I think thankfully tourism has really recovered well in the last couple of years. And in line with that, we would see the current account deficit come back to normal levels. So I'm not exactly losing a lot of sleep about that in that sense, because that was a natural outcome of the pandemic. And however, it did expose our vulnerability in a very stark way, and should bring a sense of urgency in terms of building out other foreign exchange, saving, and earning sectors in the event that we experience another shock like that. But a shock like what happened with COVID, with the Barbados economy structured as it is, the current account deficit exploding like that, really there was no other outcome that was possible. We basically didn't have tourists coming. We were not earning that money. As tourism recovers, as it has quite nicely, especially in the last 2 years post-COVID lockdowns, that will recover. What it does, however, is it does should bring for us a sense of urgency in terms of how we build out, incentivize, facilitate, maybe more than incentivize, foreign exchange earning, foreign exchange saving sectors.
Yeah, well, I guess you rightfully said it exposes how vulnerable Caribbean economies are in terms of its dependency on tourism. And we had some persons in the comments asking about agriculture as a feasible industry to help save foreign exchange, to help to cut the food import bill. Agriculture was mainly the only sector that grew during COVID, according to the central bank reports. So how do you see agriculture playing a role in the new Barbados, in terms of savings, in terms of earnings, really, export? Because we're doing a lot, or trying to get a lot of exports happening. So how do you see agriculture playing a role in that?
Okay, so again, the whole agriculture story is not a simple one. So we are a small country, not relatively. Barbados is a small country with limited land space. So there are some natural limitations on our capacity within the area of agriculture. We've developed, have a large population relative to our, we currently have a relatively large population, but this is one of the more densely populated places on the globe. And with the tourism industry and hospitality, land is not cheap. Also, labor is not cheap. So there are some issues around agriculture. However, I mean, so there's one, the issue of food security. So certainly as much as we can grow for domestic consumption is quite important in terms of food security. Healthy food is also important. Fresh foods and so on is also important. We have a chronic communicable disease crisis, obesity. So again, healthy food, linkages with tourism and hospitality. So certainly agriculture is extremely important. I think we have to be realistic given our small size, the limited land space, the cost of land, the population on the space. But there are a lot of new possibilities in terms of technology in agriculture. I think for historical reasons coming out of plantation, slavery, and so on, we had a negative view of agriculture. People didn't want their kids to go into the land and so on and so forth. And we also do have to be quite cognizant of what people earn from agriculture compared to other areas. So I think we have to be conscious of all of that. But certainly, as much as we can grow is to be encouraged. And I think key to that is the use of a lot of the new technologies in agriculture to make it more appealing to persons as distinct from the traditional image and so on. Again, because one, food security, healthy food, saving foreign exchange, and also some linkages with the tourism industry. But again, I think we also have to be very practical about how far, how much of this we can do. Well, I think a lot more can be done.
But we have a comment here from To Drop Waldron that say, I'm just repeating what it said, that the government is handing the agricultural sector to the Chinese. Um,
Well,
guessing,
I'm unable to comment on that.
yeah, yeah. You don't have to. I mean, just sharing the
No,
thoughts. So,
that's the person is making a comment. Just saying I'm unable to comment on that.
yeah. Um, but we just sharing some of what the questions. So I know we started. I actually want to take some questions from the audience, some more questions, and then we can definitely get back to the
Yeah, right,
conversation.
because that's important because I see we've been on for an hour and 40 minutes. So I need to wrap up like around 9.
Yeah. No, you're gonna
Yeah.
wrap. You think? Um, yeah. So there's some questions quickly here from the audience. Somebody's saying here, Galbe is saying that the government spends tons of money on tourism, but are we really getting the returns to match the injected funds? Uh, Somebody here is saying I say hotels should have to be renewable since they're receiving so many tax breaks and incentives. Troy White is saying many private sector buildings have solar panels and are receiving and are having a net reduction in their electricity costs. This is basic and quite common in most new private sector buildings. Political will are the levels of the tax reduction or incentives for hotels should be based on how green they are. Um, right. Galvez said that he made the comment
I
earlier,
can see that. I can see that the hotels are not popular in this audience.
but yeah, they're really not. um, True Drop Walden is saying that the government will never invest in any large outlay on renewable energy. The IMF is moving the government away from large investments. Um, Somebody's saying here, if our waters get polluted, tourism is done. Um, Somebody's saying it's like this: Kemar, fossil fuels will always be with you. Just look at the takes to manufacture renewable energy products. Somebody says seaweed farms may be an answer for carbon capture and storage. Um, yeah, right. Yeah, so basically, the audience made their comments here.
Yeah, I know, Kim. I mean, one thing I want to say, and that's certainly just a personal view. Huh?
Mhm.
I am not, and people don't have to agree on it. I mean, just I'm not a great fan of the government or technocrats or the people trying to pick winners and pick what sectors. So, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of fantastic ideas being floated in the chat. Now, which of these are commercially viable? I really don't know enough to say. You really have to drill down. I mean, that's one of the things people I would encourage you to think about. Huh? A good idea and a commercially viable idea are not necessarily one and the same thing. So with these things, people really have to drill down. What are the potential revenues and the costs? I think what is important is that we have a government policy framework. We have the financial system and sectors that good ideas can find their way to the top. That we are not blocking anything from coming true. But I'm not a big fan of trying to pick winners. I mean, I don't really know that I can sit and say, well, this gonna work and that gonna work and that's not gonna work. You really have to go through the details, detailed business plans, understanding the costs and potential revenues. But it's important to have the ideas, not to kill them off too early with any negativity. Give them a chance to bubble up because you really don't know in advance what is going to work, in a sense. Which is why it's important to have a big pool that actually comes through because we really don't know what is commercially viable. Huh?
Yeah, well, I guess that is why investors like to go for government guarantees so that they ensure return on investment. And when the question came up earlier, I wanted to make this comment about uh, how come the private sector does not invest more. But if you look at private sectors all through the Caribbean, they tend not to take on very much risk
Yeah,
in
but
these type.
even again, what is commercially viable? Okay, so I have solar panels on my house. Is it really a commercially viable investment for me? I mean, when I look at my monthly light bill without it, the cost of buying the panels, putting them on the roof, the reduction in my life, I mean, the amount of years it takes me to recover the money I put in. Could I have put the money in something else that would have done better for me? So those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about when I say you really have to drill down as to really what is commercially viable. And business people are very good at that. Huh?
Mhm.
So when I see business people avoiding investments, there may be a very good reason why they are avoiding those investments, in that they really might not be commercially viable. The returns relative to what you're putting in and the risk might not make it worth it. And I think that's something I don't think enters our discussion around what we should be doing or what we could be doing. What is going to be commercially viable?
Yeah. Well, yes, yeah, I explained it quite well. But we have 9 minutes. No, I'm not wrapping at nine, but yeah, but I'm
Like
gonna
I
leave
think
you.
an electric vehicle is probably a very good investment given the energy costs.
Yeah, but that's gonna lead to my next question. And someone was asking the point here about consumer prices. The average electric vehicle costs about $100,000, right?
Yeah.
Um, I know that the government was providing loans to public servants to invest in electric vehicles, but uh, let's look at the average person in Barbados.
No, I agree.
Um,
The cost of the vehicle up front is not necessarily within the reach of a lot of people. That's certainly an issue. I'm seeing more and more of these smaller hybrids on the road. I mean, I don't know what the retail prices for some of the smaller hybrids I'm seeing on the road. But given the cost of gasoline, though, that often can make the numbers work in people's favor. But again, somebody needs to crunch the numbers. If you are buying a car, the cost of a fossil fuel versus a renewable versus an electric, what you're going to be spending on gas relative to your light bill, and crunch the numbers and really see how it's going to play out. Huh?
mhm. Yeah. Well,
Because
that's
depending on where you live and the driving you are doing and so on, your gas bill can be quite massive in Barbados. Your monthly gas bill, when you factor that on the amount you are servicing for the loan, you really have to really sit down and crunch those kinds of numbers. Huh?
yeah, yeah. Well, that's something for the
Maybe on one of your
the
shows, Kemar, you might have one of those kind of sessions, where it's almost like helping people with personal finance and really crunching through some of those numbers and what it might look like. Huh?
yeah, that's something that I'm definitely interested in. So we could probably plan it for a later date that you will get the correct advisors, and we can invite persons on to do that.
Yep.
But you have 5 more minutes. I mean, we're not going at 9, but we're gonna give Mr. Robinson his excuse at 9. We're just gonna stay on for a bit after that to just have a little bit of discussion among us, the audience. But before you go, sir, there's a question here. We are overtaxed in this country already, Professor Robinson. As an economist, can you please tell me whether or not government will bring a tax-free budget or a tax-induced one?
Okay. Well, I'm not an OBA man, so I don't have a way of knowing what the government will bring in its budget. I don't have any special insight there. But I think, as I said earlier in the show, I would be very surprised if there are new tax measures in the estimates and the budget. We've really had a lot of revenue raising measures implemented already. So I'm actually expecting a budget that doesn't include new taxes. So that's my expectation, but I don't know. I don't have any insight. I'm not at the table in the budget preparation or the estimates preparation.
Yeah. Well, for the benefit of the doubt, Jamaica actually had 7 budgets that were tax free.
Yes.
Um, so tax free budgets are indeed very possible. There is a way in which governments can operate without increasing taxation upfront directly. But my 2 cents about it is that we may have more the reforms to the state-owned enterprises, which may mean that we may see some increases in fees and levies on state-owned enterprises, but not necessarily increases in direct taxation. So, for example, the Water Authority, which the Prime Minister said the private sector is now into the supply of water. You might see some levies being put there on the water bill to be able to fund that transition, right? The sanitation, um, something else may come in place to help fund the operation because the government is cutting transfers to SOEs to allow them to become more financially stable and viable because they can't keep supporting them any longer because we just don't have the fiscal space to do it anymore. So I hope that answers your question on the budget. But we've come to the end of this particular segment with Professor Robinson. I had a very good discussion today. I want to give him the last word. He has 3 minutes to wrap up, and then I will take back over from him after those 3 minutes. So, Professor Robinson, the floor is yours.
Okay, so again, thanks for the invitation, Kemar, and the opportunity to engage with you and your audience. And I like to make a distinction between, the economy. You have the economy, which is this broad concept, and within it, you have the public finances. I think since 2018, we've seen a significant improvement in the public finances. Deficits have come down. We've seen the foreign exchange reserves get boosted. Debt to GDP have come down and so on. So all of these public finance indicators have all moved in the right direction. Now, they have improved in an environment where for most of those years there wasn't growth. So a lot of that has really come from austerity, which is why in a way there's a disconnect between the improvements in the public finances and how persons in the wider economy are feeling. Now, the last 2 years have been very positive in terms of economic growth. And I think a lot is going to depend now on whether further improvements in the public finances are going to come from economic growth as distinct from austerity, or this disconnect is going to continue. So I think the government has done a very good job, the administration, in terms of improving the public finances. And that has been reflected in passing the IMF test, improvements in the credit ratings. But in a sense, that's necessary, but not sufficient. I think we now need to see improvements in the wider economy. In a sense, the public is not where people want some benefit or payback for the sacrifice made in improving the public finances. And I think that's the challenge going forward, generating that growth, better paying jobs, a more diversified economy, better quality of public services. I think these are going to be the tests going forward because, in a sense, we are ticking the public finance box, but we are still at the early stage of improving the wider economy. So again, thanks for the opportunity. All the best for you on the show, and thanks to the audience. So thank you very much.
Yes, well, thank you very much, sir. We greatly appreciate having Justin Robinson. He spent a long 2 hours with us. I'm not taking you up to 10 o'clock tonight. I'm just giving you a half hour more that we can have a discussion among us, the audience. So I'm here to take your questions. I'm here to just have general economic discussions and to follow up also on some of the points that Mr. Robinson made as well. So I heavily rely on your feedback because Economy Thursdays is essentially a show for you, the people, to have direct information from the professionals about the Barbados economy. Now, I must say that this is not a political show, so this is more of a professional show. To have professionals coming on to give us the information, and we started out very excellent tonight. I really enjoyed tonight's discussion with Professor Robinson, and I really hope that you guys enjoyed uh, the show. Now, we have somebody here asking about Argentina, right? Um, Argentina is a very interesting case. Argentina, um, deep in IMF debt. I mean, they seriously choking uh, because Argentina just went lockstep into the IMF reforms without not necessarily taking into consideration the domestic space. So the IMF policies were actually a mismatch for the Argentinians, like privatization, a lot of state-owned enterprises, cuts the same cuts to the SOEs, increasing the same primary surplus targets. So putting more and more and more revenue extractive measures on the Argentinians, the devaluation of the Argentinian currency, right? High inflation, so high skyrocketing prices during the Argentina. So if Barbados does not be careful, we're going to end up exactly like Argentina, exactly like Mexico, and we also may go the route of Guyana and Jamaica, right? Because people don't want to seem to believe the facts that the IMF was in Jamaica for so long, and they have not left yet, right? And Barbados has an office belonging to the IMF, which is housed at the Central Bank of Barbados, right? And then we have our former governors, well, the current governor of the central bank, who was taken directly from the International Monetary Fund. And so there are quite a few similarities in the IMF philosophy and in how the current central bank is being run and being managed. And through Mr. Greenwich's advice to the Prime Minister then, you saw a lot of the IMF recommendations included into the government policy, right? So, meeting the primary surplus target, as Professor Robertson explained, what government spend, what government makes, minus interest payments, right? So the government, as you know, continuously spends much more revenue than it earns, right? And the government run deficits, right? But the IMF is saying to Barbados that you need to roll back the amount of money that you spend in the Barbados economy. Allow the private sector to take a more forward role, right? Allow the private sector to take a more forward role and to stop crowding out private sector investment because the government realistically cannot compete, or the private sector cannot compete with the government. The government has the authority, has policy that they could pass regulations to make the competition in the economic space unfair, that the government directly benefits, right? So what the IMF is suggesting to Barbados is that for the government to move itself out of the way and allow the private sector to take a more serious development role. We have EMCX asking that the government reduce the civil service wage bill. Well, up front they did, or I would say up front they gave the impression that they did. But what occurred was that the government sent home 1,000 people, right? In the first tranche of the IMF program, 1,000. On top of that, then the ash workers went home, but the ash workers were temporary workers. They were not actual civil servants or public workers, right? So they were contractors that the government paid as contractors without NAS, without income tax, right? So the government owed those people nothing at the end of it, right? So the wage bill in itself was a problem for the IMF because the wage bill was over like $800 million, right? Let's not forget that the last administration under the Minister of Finance, Chris Sinclair, um, his policy was to borrow the money that was being printed from the central bank and to borrow the monies from the National Insurance Fund to pay the civil service wage bill, right? But that was not a sustainable practice because today, after the government debt restructuring, the government now owes the central bank $1.6 billion, right? And included in the IMF reports, the IMF recommendations, is that the government has to find a mean and a way to be able to repay the central bank that $1.6 billion. They need to find a mean and a way to replenish the national insurance from losing $1 billion as well, right? They need to find a mean and a way to repay the treasury bills because the government wrote off over $1 billion in treasury bills, right? And they passed the debt settlement bill. And remember, you can use alternate views to, become au fait with the information. So in alternate views, they spoke about the debt settlement bill, and that as part of world economic history in Barbados, the government restructured treasury bills, which completely destroyed confidence in the local investment market. And to this day, they have not honored their debt obligations of cash repayment to those persons who had treasury bills. Now, Barbados, if you research all of the economic history and go through all of them, only 3 countries in the world ever restructured treasury bills. Russia, they did it in 1998. Ukraine, they did it also in 1998. But remember, Russia and Ukraine were part of the Soviet Union, right? And then Uruguay, they did it in 2003. So only 3 countries in the world ever restructured treasury bills because it is a very dangerous thing when a government to do something like that, because on every balance sheet, and I learned this when I studied a course called Risk Management and Analysis. We studied the banking system in Barbados, and on every balance sheet there's a clause called sovereign risk, right? A sovereign risk is the chance that the government will or will not repay their debt obligations, or that they will default on debt. So the debt default by the government in 2018 massively increased the sovereign risk profile of Barbados and puts us into danger territory that we are now known internationally as a country that does not repay its debts. I will say that again. The debt default in Barbados that the government did in 2018 increased the sovereign risk profile of Barbados into danger territory that we are now known internationally as a country that does not repay its debts. So therefore, every loan that we borrow has an increased premium on it, which means that it's more expensive for Barbados than most other countries to borrow debt. Right? But we were not told that. We are still banned from international credit markets. So traditionally, we borrow from Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, Credit Suisse, the private banking sector, the investment banking sector. But because of the debt default, Barbados no longer has that leniency. Right? And we are banned from borrowing from those banks. And that is why we are seeing a massive increase in the debt portfolio towards the IMF and the CDP and the multilateral system. Right? The reason Barbados is not being downgraded by the IMF, or not the IMF, but the credit rating agencies, is because we are in another IMF program. Moody's and the rating agencies said last year, this was before Barbados signed the last IMF program on December 7th, 2022. They said that as long as Barbados signs another IMF program, that they will receive no credit downgrades. Right? So the protection of the IMF program stops the rating agencies from downgrading the country. Right? Okay. My book is available on Amazon. So you can order it directly on Amazon, or you can head to the University of the West Indies bookshop at Cave Hill. They're available there as well. Online, Amazon, alternate views, or you can head to University of the West Indies bookshop at Cave Hill and grab yourselves a copy. Right. But as I was saying, the reasons we are not being downgraded is because of the IMF program and the fact that we are in an IMF program. So all of that is what economists would call coercion. Right? You're being coerced subtly to sign over into another IMF program. So if Barbados took the route of not signing on to another IMF program, they would have downgraded us. Right? Not that the credit rating is high right now. It's not. The credit rating of Barbados is at junk status. Right? Junk status. But if you read the news, you will hear the officials talking about the credit rating has been upgraded 6 notches. That is a misrepresentation of what is actually happening and not directly facts. Right? So there are levels or different levels. I'm trying to try to put it on the screen. Right? There are different levels to credit ratings. And there are different levels of junk. So the Barbados economy has just been upgraded from levels of junk. Right? Just different levels of junk. So it's not anything to celebrate per se, because we still cannot borrow from private international markets because of the debt default. So until we remedy that situation, in terms of trying to get ourselves back onto the credit markets, having these credit upgrades mean nothing to the country, because if you remember listening to the Prime Minister, they were saying that the reason for borrowing from the IMF and the IDB and those places was because of cheap money and that the interest rates were 1%. But no, the interest rates are no longer 1% because they jumped 400%. And that is why the Prime Minister was in Congress saying to the Congress that the LIBOR rate, the London interbank rate, lending rate, is now causing them to be paying upwards of 400% more in interest on the loans, because the London interbank rate goes up almost every year. And those international loans from the IMF and the World Bank and the CDB are actually tied to the London interbank rate. So every time it goes up, the interest rate on these IMF loans goes up. And that is how you end up in a debt trap. So I have on the screen here the rating agencies, right? And I'm gonna task you, the viewers, can somebody put in the chat what is Barbados's credit rating right now that you can see for yourselves, right? You have triple A, prime, which means good, sweet. Everybody want to invest in you, right? You have A plus, double A plus, and you see any different. You have S&P, they have their grades. You have Moody's, they have their grades, and you have Fitch. All three different types of rating agencies, and they have the different gradings, right? And you can see it here on the screen, right? So yes, square 4, I am explaining the level of junk, different levels of junk. So I'm gonna come down here. Anything that is below an A minus is not healthy. So a B, triple B plus, not healthy. B double A1, not healthy. Triple B plus, not healthy, right? Triple B, not healthy. Anything below a triple B plus is not healthy for investment, right? So just look at this in terms of the investment grades. You have lower, medium grade, non-investment grade, highly speculative, substantial risk, and extremely speculative investment grades, right? And somebody here says that the Barbados debt is at B minus, B3, and B. So if we look at the charts, we can see clearly that Barbados is still at non-investment grade. Right? Barbados credit rating is still not at investment grade. Right? So when you see the policymakers celebrating, right, that the Barbados economy is upgrading, and it is this and it is doing that, you now have the facts that the Barbados credit rating is still at junk status, right? And the reason why we're not being downgraded is simply because the IMF has said, not the IMF, the credit rating agencies have said that as long as Barbados signs on to the next IMF program, which was signed in December 7th, 2022, that we will no longer be downgraded. Okay. Compare that to the previous years when Barbados was constantly being downgraded. Okay. At that time, we were not in the IMF program, but we are now, and we're going to be for quite some time, right? Because the loan repayment schedule ends around 2050, 250. So despite the debt to GDP target for Barbados being 60% by 2035, the loan repayments to pay back these people, most of them are redeemable in 2050. So you see how long the IMF is going to be in Barbados, right? So on that basis alone, having the IMF's based in Barbados, the credit rating agencies, based off their own admission, are not going to downgrade the country in any way. So I'm going to put that back up again. Okay. Trying to get it up here that you can see my screen. How are you seeing my screen? You're not seeing my screen. Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that start screen. Yes. Right. So yes, we saw there that the chart for the international credit rating agency showed us the different grades. Oh, whoa, somebody's saying they can't see. I'm trying to put it up once more. Hey. Hey. Let me know if you can see it. Wait, I have it up again. So just let me know if you can see it or if you cannot see it. Whoa. All right, let me try that again. I'm gonna put it. I'm gonna try that once more. My apologies. We're gonna go at it once more. But I just showed you the different levels of the credit rating agencies, just to show you that Barbados is not at investment grade, despite the good news of credit upgrades. You're still not there as it relates to investment grade. Um, just give me 1 second. I'm bringing it up. Bringing it up. Having a bit of a technical challenge here and not sure what's happening. Hey, they're having a bit of a technical issue here. The screen, not sure what is going on. Yeah, but it's not coming up at the moment. I'm not sure exactly what it's in, but it's telling me here that it's on the screen, you know. But yeah, but I'm gonna read it out for you because it's not showing on the screen. But the rating agencies, as I said, or the grade here is prime, high grade, upper medium grade, lower medium grade, non-investment grade. So you want a credit rating agency that says A, right? That says A. Barbados does not have that, right? Barbados has something in the B, right? Barbados has a B minus, and anything below B, right, is not healthy. The grade is not healthy, right? Not healthy. B, triple B is not good. That's called lower medium grade. So an A minus is upper medium grade, which is considered to be good. Barbados' credit rating is not anywhere near A, and that's why we're still banned from the credit markets, because we're still in the lower medium grade to non-investment grade. Hey, so in explaining that to you, of course, I always need assistance. Right. So in explaining the grade to you, you get a better understanding of what is going on. But I will prepare for you next time that we're going to be here next Thursday again. We have another interesting guest coming on. I would announce over the weekend, but we're going to be here next week. We have 5 more minutes on the show. Let's not forget to like, to share, to subscribe. But yeah, but if the professor thinks the government is doing a good job, as he said, most economists don't agree on anything. really. All of them have a different perspective on issues. Um, that's his right to think that the government is doing a stellar job. I don't necessarily think that the government does a lot of things right. They do some things right at the source in terms of economic changes. They did uh, make some moves to try to correct some of the economic imbalances that were inherited from the last DLP government. If you're being honest and you're being fair, some of the economic indicators of the last administration were not necessarily going in the right direction. So some type of corrective measures were put in place. Um, how they were put in place was not necessarily the best way to do it, and the influence of the IMF is causing the government to take a route that is not necessarily beneficial to the people at the lower income groups or the middle class of the country, because they're giving tax breaks and tax write-offs to the higher income earners, and they're cutting social services and cutting the specific benefits to the low income groups. So non-contributory pension being cut, the cutting the welfare program, the continued privatization of essential utilities like Barbados Water Authority. Uh, Soon you're going to also seek to privatize the sanitation service authority. So we're going to say that now and say that early. Uh, right, right. So they're going to privatize the sanitation service authority. Eventually, the hospital is going to become a privately run entity, like in America. And unless you have medical insurance, it's going to be very difficult to be seen by a doctor in Barbados. And we're already going that specific direction. So the changing dynamics of the Barbados economy through part agreement with the IMF program is not necessarily the best route that Barbados could have taken, because there were other options available on the table that Barbados could have used outside of the austerity plan, which is the BERT plan. So my thing is all about priorities, and the government chose their priorities, right? So it takes, and this is where I'm not speaking about political parties, but it takes proper economic planning to plan a country out of the current crisis that is in, because Barbados is essentially in a debt trap, right? And this level of debt diplomacy, do you think that forgiveness? Well, the problem for Barbados receiving debt forgiveness is that Barbados has what we call a high per capita income, right? So our high per capita income means really like where the average person has a specific level of money coming in, and it doesn't have to be cash money, but it's money in services, money in social services, so free healthcare, free education, subsidized housing, low income tax, reverse tax credit. All of these things are considered to be income, which are then classified into what you call per capita income. So for the IMF, the average Barbadian has a high level of per capita income. So therefore, collectively, the country does not qualify to receive that forgiveness based off the high levels of per capita income. So when you hear the Prime Minister speaking about Barbados' per capita income levels, they are rolling out policies that are going to roll back that high per capita income and cut the average income, or cut the income to the average man, right? So when you reduce that, essentially bringing people back down to poverty, but it then qualifies the country as a poor country to say, well, look, we are substantially poor, so therefore that gives us the impetus now to ask the World Bank and the IMF based off our we now become a lesser developed country, we cannot receive debt. Because there are a lot of countries that received debt forgiveness from the World Bank after COVID, but Barbados didn't. And that is basically the reason why we did not. But it is 9:30 and I promised to stick to time. So we've come to the end of our session. I'm not going out to Tay tonight. So I also want to thank you all for tuning in. I had a very good discussion with Professor Robinson. I know I've had a very good chat with you, the audience, because it's essentially important to sit with you guys and take your questions and feedback to you about essentially how Barbados is being managed economically. I look forward to another session like this. We're going to do the same format next week. We're going to have a guest and then we're going to sit for half an hour that I can take in your questions and feedback and, we share among each other. So thank you guys. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Marcia. Thank you, Caswell. Thank you, Sir Alfred Benjamin, Diana Seal, Galvez, Square Four, the usual suspects. Thank you to anybody who has never been on before, but you're on. Thank you, Annette Wood. Again, next week we are back here again, and we'll be having more discussions about the Barbados economy on Economy Thursdays, and we'll go on from there. So the Marcia Week Show is again live tomorrow at 7 p.m. Don't forget to tune in. We'll be back live again. And then on Saturday is the march in Bridgetown. So I want to encourage you all to go and to support the march. So we look forward to seeing you again next week, Thursday, same day, same time. And don't forget to share the link. Don't forget to subscribe to the page. And let us have some very fruitful discussions. Bring your questions next week. And let us go from there. So thank you all. I wish to send you off to have a night of peace and relaxation. And I will see you all next week. God's willing, God's bless. And we'll chat later. So good night, everyone. It was very good to be with you. Alternate views. And I'll see you later. So goodbye, everyone.